They burned my shoes in the yard, laughing, crawl inside. I remember the hiss of the flames as if the fire were breathing, greedy and sharp, and the acrid smell of rubber and leather curling into the air while my daughter-in-law stood with her, arms folded like a judge who had already reached her verdict. They said I walked too slow, that my shoes made me look pathetic, that no one wanted to be seen in public with an old woman who shuffled along in orthopedic soles. And instead of speaking up for me, instead of saying even one small word of kindness, my son just stood there with that tight smile he wears when he is pretending to be above cruelty, when he wants to believe that silence makes him innocent. I had bought those shoes 15 years earlier with my own wages, saved from long shifts at the clinic, the kind of shoes that were built not for vanity, but for survival, shoes that allowed me to keep working after my knees began to grind like old, doors on rusty hinges, shoes that carried me through markets and waiting rooms, and long evenings of walking back from bus stops when nobody thought to offer me a ride. And now here they were, crackling and spitting in the fire pit, treated as if they were vermin, treated as if I had left some contamination in the house that had to be purged. I am 74 years old, though lately I feel both older and younger than that number, as though age has split into two roads, one leading me back to the trembling girl I once was, the other pushing me forward into a shadow where people believe I have already disappeared. I live now in a small apartment above a pharmacy, a place where the walls are thin and the stairs groan, but where each corner belongs to me alone, where no one sighs when I take too long with the kettle, where no one rolls their eyes when I hum while folding laundry. But before that, before this fragile independence, I lived in the house of my son, a house that I had once helped him pay for, not just with money, but with the years of mothering that shaped his very ability to stand. And yet, when he unlocked the ducker for me, it was never as a welcome guest, never as the woman who had given him life, but as a tolerated inconvenience. When I close my eyes at night, I still hear the laughter from that afternoon. It wasn't joyful laughter, the kind that loosens your ribs and leaves you breathless with delight. No, this was the thin laughter of mockery, the kind that sharpens rather than softens, the kind that seeks to erase someone from the circle of the human. My granddaughter held her phone up, recording the fire, saying, "Look, Grandma's shoes are melting like marshmallows." And I remember thinking, marshmallows, yes, except marshmallows are sweet and wanted and shared around the fire. And here I was, watching my existence be turned into a cheap joke. I wanted to scream. I wanted to slap the phone out of her hands, but instead I felt myself shrink, the way I have so many times in recent years, folding my anger into silence, because I had been taught that silence was survival, that a mother does not strike back at her children, that an old woman should be grateful for shelter even if it is full of contempt. It is strange how humiliation lodges in the body. My feet still ache as if they remember the fire directly, as if my skin absorbed the smoke, even though I was standing several steps away. I had not expected to be a spectacle that day. I had only come into the kitchen wearing those shoes, as I always did, planning to go out for a walk before supper, when my daughter-in-law wrinkled her nose and said, "Godmother, those things are a disgrace." I thought it would end there, just another barb in a long chain of barbs. But she called the children over, told them to look at the relic, and within minutes they had dragged me outside like a child in trouble at school, demanding that I hand over what was mine, demanding that I watch as the flames turned the souls into bubbling black tar. My son lit the match. He did it casually, almost with relief, as though destroying those shoes were a necessary act of hygiene, as though ridding the house of my presence in increments might one day free him from me entirely. And I stood there, my arms pressed to my sides, my voice locked in my throat, feeling that old, familiar conflict between rage and paralysis. It is not the first time I have been told to be less, to step aside, to swallow my dignity for the sake of family harmony. Decades ago, my husband would leave the dinner table without a word. The slam of the door, his declaration that my words were too heavy for him, and I would sit with the children, smiling thinly, so they would not know how the silence cut me. That training remains. You hold yourself still. You let the cruelty pass over you like weather, because you believe foolishly that if you do not resist, it will eventually fade. But it does not fade. It thickens, accumulates, becomes the climate you are forced to breathe. I tell you this now from a room where the window overlooks a busy street, where every morning I watch people hurrying below with bags of medicine and children tugging at their sleeves, and I think of the yard where my shoes turn to smoke, and I wonder how many other women have stood in a yard like that, reduced to a joke, their belongings burned as if they themselves were being burned, their very usefulness denied in front of the people they once fed, bathed, and sheltered. I begin with that moment because it was the flare, the spark, the undeniable proof that I had already been exiled, even while standing in the center of their lives. The fire ended quickly, as all fires do when the fuel is small, but the smell lingered in my nostrils for hours, the stench of synthetic material breaking down, a chemical reminder that what is destroyed cannot be reclaimed. Later, when I returned to the kitchen, barefoot and shaky, my daughter-in-law said, "We'll get you something more appropriate, don't worry," as though I were a child who had outgrown her shoes, as though appropriateness were a gift she could bestow. My son had already turned away, speaking to the children about homework, pretending nothing had happened. I walked to my room, shut the door, and sat on the bed with my feet pressed against the cool floorboards, and I thought, they believe they are preparing me for the crawl, for the moment when I will be on my knees asking for permission to exist. And perhaps I had been crawling in other ways for years without even knowing it. But the strange thing about fire is that it not only consumes, it illuminates. That day, in their yard, surrounded by laughter that was not laughter, something in me began to see differently, more sharply, as if the flames had burned a hole through the fog I had lived in. So here I am, 74 years old, no longer waiting to be carried, no longer willing to be treated as a shadow. I am telling you this not because I want pity, but because the memory of fire still walks beside me, because the sound of those shoes crackling has become a drumbeat, a warning, a reminder that even the smallest object, once destroyed with malice, can awaken a woman to the fact that she has nothing left to lose but her silence. The real wound did not open the moment the flames curled around the shoes, though that would have been enough to scar anyone. It opened later in the quiet exchange. That followed in the way my son's voice cut away any possibility that I might still believe myself part of his family. I remember how, after the smoke thinned and the children drifted inside, I turned to him, still half barefoot, my skin chilled from the grass, and I asked him quietly why he had let it happen, why he had not said anything, why he had not once told them to stop. He would not meet my eyes. He only shifted the weight of his shoulders, folded his arms across his chest, and said, "Mother, they're just shoes. Don't start a drama." That sentence was the blade, sharper than the fire, sharper than the jeering of children, sharper even than the recording on my granddaughter's phone, because it was not only dismissal of an object, but dismissal of me, of my right to protest, of my ability to feel wronged. They're just shoes. Don't start a drama. What he really meant was, you are just an old woman. Don't ask to be taken seriously. I stood there, holding my silence like a cracked plate, wondering what expression he saw on my face, whether he believed I was chastened, whether he thought his words had put the matter to rest. Perhaps that is what hurt most, that he did not even sense how deeply he had struck me. He thought it was a small correction, the kind you give a child who has spoken out of turn, and then he walked away into the kitchen, where his wife had already opened a bottle of wine, and the laughter of adults rose again, leaving me outside in the dusk like an object returned to storage. I leaned against the wall of the house, feeling the roughness of the siding against my back, and I realized that this was not an isolated moment of cruelty, but the culmination of years, of decades, in which my worth had been measured only in how quietly I could exist. That night I lay awake in the small guest room they called mine, but never truly let me own, staring at the faint glow of the hallway light seeping under the door. And I thought of every time my son had turned my devotion into obligation. I thought of the down payment I had provided for the house, money from bonds I had kept since my husband's death, handed over because he said it was just temporary until he could refinance. I thought of the countless weekends I had spent babysitting children who never said thank you, of the bills I had helped cover with the last of my savings, of the hours I spent cooking in their kitchen, only to be told that my recipes were outdated, too heavy, not healthy enough. I thought of how slowly my photographs had disappeared from the walls, replaced by stage portraits of his wife's family, as though I had been erased from his history. All of it pointed to the same truth, but I had refused to say it aloud, because saying it aloud meant I could no longer hide behind the illusion that I still belonged. The fire stripped away the illusion. The following morning, as I came into the kitchen in my socks, still aching from the memory of the previous day, my daughter-in-law handed me a list of chores. It was not even couched as a request. She told me to fold laundry, to water plants, to keep the children from making a mess in the living room. She did not thank me. She did not even glance at me as she rattled off the instructions, already focused on her phone, scrolling through something that made her smile. I stood there, holding the list, and for the first time in years, I felt my hands tremble, not from weakness, but from the effort of containing words that wanted to burst out. Yet I said nothing. I nodded. I took the list. I let her move past me, as if I were a housemaid, whose presence required no acknowledgement. Later that afternoon, when my son returned from work, he looked at the folded laundry, the watered plants, the quiet children, and he gave me the same polite nod he gives the cashier at the grocery store. That was all. It was in that moment, more than in the flames, that the betrayal fully revealed itself. It was not that they hated me, though at times it felt like hatred. It was worse. They had drained me of identity until I was just a utility, a background object, an extension of the house itself. They had reduced me to a service, and once you are seen as a service, it becomes easy for others to decide when you are obsolete. My shoes, the ones they burned, had been the last visible sign of my independence, my ability to walk the streets on my own terms. By destroying them, they were symbolically destroying my right to move freely, to exist beyond the role they had carved for me. My son's words, "They're just shoes. Don't start a drama," were in fact a verdict. Stay quiet, stay small, stay contained. I remember going to bed early that night, but sleep would not come. My heart felt both heavy and strangely awake, as if some long-buried part of me had begun to stir. I thought of my own mother, a woman who lived through a harder age, who had known hunger and loss, and yet never let anyone silence her. She used to tell me, the smallest cruelty will reveal the truth faster than the grandest gesture of love. I never understood it until now. The cruelty of that burned pair of shoes revealed the truth that had been building for years. I was no longer wanted, except as a relic to be tolerated when convenient. My family had decided quietly, without ever saying it aloud, that I was already half gone. And yet, lying there, staring at the ceiling, I felt something else, too. Not just grief, not just humiliation, but a flicker of defiance, like a coal that refuses to extinguish even when buried in ashes. The betrayal had cut so deep that it scraped against the core of who I am, and in scraping it, it reminded me that I still existed. I had thought myself invisible, but in truth I was only unseen by those who chose not to look. And if they would not look, if they would not hear me, then perhaps the time had come for me to stop offering myself to their blindness. Perhaps the fire had burned not only my shoes, but the last thread of obligation tying me to their contempt. That was the catalyst, though I did not know it fully then. Not the match, not the laughter, not even the words, but the quiet realization in the days that followed that I could no longer survive by shrinking. The betrayal was complete, and because it was complete, it gave me clarity. I saw suddenly that the life I had been living was already a kind of death, and that if I wanted to keep breathing, I would have to choose differently. I would have to find a way to walk again, even without shoes, even if it meant stumbling, even if it meant walking away from the very people I had once lived for. In the days that followed the fire, the atmosphere inside the house changed in ways that were almost invisible from the outside, but undeniable once you were the one breathing it. Nothing was said directly, no confrontation, no open argument, yet the texture of every hour grew rougher, as though each wall had absorbed the cruelty of the flames, and now echoed it back to me in small, persistent ways. It began with the silence, the kind of silence that is not peaceful, but disciplinary, a silence that watches you closely until you adjust yourself, until you begin moving in smaller patterns so as not to disturb. Meals became sharper around the edges. At the dinner table, my son and his wife talked over me, about schools, about investments, about vacations, and when I tried to join the conversation, my words fell into the space like dropped coins that no one bothers to pick up. The children no longer asked me questions. They scrolled on their phones or whispered to each other, and if they looked at me at all, it was with the faint amusement one reserves for an odd pet, tolerated but unnecessary. One evening, I placed my fork down a little too loudly by accident, the metal tapping against the plate, and my daughter-in-law flinched with exaggerated irritation, muttering, "So sensitive to sound these days." My son didn't correct her. Instead, he continued talking about a project at work, his eyes never once turning toward mine. It was a small moment, but it set the tone for everything that followed. I began eating more quickly, more carefully, measuring each bite, rehearsing in my head the angle of my fork, as though I had returned to childhood lessons of etiquette, except this time I was not learning to fit into society. I was learning how to erase myself from theirs. The house itself seemed to conspire. My belongings, few as they were, began to disappear. At first it was a teacup, one with a blue rim that I had carried with me since my own mother's kitchen. When I asked where it had gone, my daughter-in-law shrugged and said, "Probably chipped, I tossed it," as if it were nothing. Then it was a photograph of me with my late husband, one of the few pictures that had survived his sudden death, an image of us standing together at a county fair, The Ferris wheel blurred behind us. I had kept it on the dresser in the guest room. One day it was gone. When I asked, she said she had tidied up, that clutter wasn't good for the children, that I should keep things minimal. I nodded, but inside something twisted sharply, because photographs are not clutter. Photographs are proof, and now that proof had been quietly erased. I found myself withdrawing, retreating into smaller corners of the house. I stopped watching television in the living room because my presence there seemed to disturb the rhythm of their evenings. Instead, I watched the glow from under the door while I sat in the guest room alone, folding and refolding laundry that was already neat. I began taking my tea in the kitchen when no one else was around, standing by the counter, sipping quickly, rinsing the cup, and hiding it away before anyone could comment. My voice grew softer. I noticed myself whispering even when there was no need. It was not a conscious decision. It was survival. When you are constantly told through sighs and glances and silence that you take up too much space, you begin to shrink, and soon shrinking feels like breathing. There were moments when the cruelty became visible, though still disguised as concern. One afternoon when I came back from a short walk around the block, moving slowly because my knees had stiffened, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice from the kitchen. She was on the phone with a friend, her tone light, casual, but every word laced with steel. "She's like a shadow," she said, "always hovering. Honestly, it's exhausting." I mean, what do you do with someone who just lingers? I stood in the hallway, my hands still on the doorframe, listening as though she were describing a ghost. In a way she was, a ghost that lived under her roof, but did not belong. Later, when I entered the room, she smiled politely and offered me a cup of tea, as though those words had not been spoken. I accepted, my hands steady, my voice even, but inside I felt the confirmation of what I had feared, that I had already become, to them, an unwanted presence, tolerated only because expelling me would require more explanation than they were willing to give. It worsened in subtler ways, too. My chair at the dining table was moved closer to the corner, angled slightly away from the center as though by accident. When guests came over, I was introduced vaguely, never as mother, never as grandmother, but as someone staying with them for a while. The language of erasure is powerful. It doesn't shout, it whispers, until you find yourself questioning whether you have the right to claim the words you once owned. I began to wonder if I was indeed overstaying, if my presence was some imposition I had invented for myself, if perhaps I was the one at fault for refusing to vanish gracefully. That is how escalation works, not through a single violent blow, but through steady corrosion, through the slow disassembling of identity, until you begin to participate in your own disappearance. And yet, despite the shrinking, something inside me resisted. Each night as I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the memory of the fire, the hiss and crackle of those shoes, and I told myself quietly that I was not yet ash, not yet cinders. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, I would slip my feet into slippers and walk down the hallway, just to hear the sound of my own steps, just to remind myself that I still had weight, that I still made noise, that I was not entirely erased. The floorboards groaned, and I almost welcomed their complaint, for it was proof that I existed. But the house fought back. My son began leaving documents casually on the kitchen table, brochures about retirement homes, articles about assisted living. Conversations started with a false lightness. "It might be nice, Mom, to have people your age around, more company." I knew what he meant. He meant that the company of his wife and children should no longer include me. He meant that I was being prepared for removal, I smiled, nodded, said I would think about it, and then returned to the guest room, where I sat in the half-dark and traced the air with my hands, as though drawing the outline of my own absence. This was the first escalation, and it was not loud, not dramatic, but it was relentless. It was the air I breathed, heavy with unspoken dismissal. Every glance that slid past me, every sigh that followed my words, every object quietly removed from my reach, all of it built into a pressure that told me I was no longer part of the living rhythm of that house. And though I shrank, though I whispered, though I stood in corners and folded myself into silence, I also began to feel something growing underneath, a quiet fury, a restless grief that could not be permanently buried. Because the more they erased me, the more I realized that I was still here, still thinking, still feeling, and perhaps one day, still capable of stepping beyond their erasure. It happened almost by accident, the way turning points often do. Not in a thunderclap of revelation, but in the quiet stumble of an ordinary day that suddenly changes direction. I had gone out for a walk one afternoon, a slow, halting walk that I had begun to take regularly, if only to escape the press of silence in the house. And I found myself drifting farther than usual, past the neat rows of houses with trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, past the playground where young mothers stood in clusters, their laughter tight and bright, until I reached the edge of a small commercial street I had never noticed before. The stores were modest, some already closing, their windows filled with faded posters, and tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop was a consignment store with a crooked sign that read, "Treasures Twice Loved." I might have walked past it, but something about the word loved tugged at me, as though it were a word I had not heard spoken to me in years, and so I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and fabric that had lingered too long in closets, but also with something gentler, the smell of possibility. Racks of clothes sagged under the weight of forgotten wardrobes. Shelves displayed chipped china and tarnished silver, and in one corner, a row of shoes lined the wall like soldiers awaiting a new assignment. My eyes drifted almost automatically to the practical ones, the sturdy flats, the low-heeled sandals, but then something gleamed from the bottom shelf, something out of place, a pair of gold heels, not subtle gold, not polite, but luminous, there, surface catching the dim light and scattering it in defiance of the gloom. They were ridiculous, inappropriate for a woman of my age and knees. Yet I felt a pull toward them so strong that I found myself kneeling down, running a hand over the smooth leather, feeling the absurd lightness of them. The woman behind the counter, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, called out, "Those won't be easy to walk in, honey." She said it with no malice, only the plain assessment of someone who had seen too many impractical choices. I almost put them back. I almost laughed at myself, muttered something about foolishness, and left. But instead, I lifted them, carried them to the counter, and said, "I'll take them." Her eyebrows rose. "You sure?" I nodded. "Yes." She hesitated, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." $5, and just like that, I owned them. When I returned to the house, I did not announce my purchase. I slipped the shoes into the guest room, closed the door, and placed them on the floor beside the bed, where they gleamed faintly, even in the low light. That night, when the house had settled into its usual chorus of muffled television and footsteps retreating upstairs, I locked my door, slipped my feet into the gold heels, and stood before the small mirror on the dresser. My reflection startled me. I looked taller, sharper, alive in a way I had not seen for years. My spine lengthened, my shoulders drew back, and though my knees protested, I took a few careful steps across the room, the sound of the heels clicking against the floorboards louder than I expected. It was a sound that startled me at first, but then I felt a surge of something close to joy. It was proof that I could still make noise, that I could still claim space. In the days that followed, the shoes became my secret ritual. When no one was watching, I wore them for minutes at a time, walking the narrow space of the room, practicing balance, relearning what it meant to take a step, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Sometimes I imagine myself walking into the kitchen in them, letting the heels strike against the tile, forcing them all to look at me, to see me not as a shadow, but as a woman who could still command attention. I did not do it, not yet, but the thought itself was enough to loosen something inside me. It was not just the shoes, though they were the spark. It was the realization that I had allowed myself to shrink so far I had forgotten what it meant to feel a pulse of defiance. The realization that dignity is not gifted by others, but claimed, sometimes in the smallest, strangest ways. The gold heels were impractical, yes, but they were also a refusal to let my steps be dictated by slippers and silence. Each night, when I placed them carefully back beside the bed, I felt a quiet promise growing. I will not crawl. And with that promise came a shift in how I carried myself even outside the room. At dinner, when my fork clinked against the plate, I did not flinch at the sigh that followed. When my daughter-in-law dismissed one of my comments as irrelevant, I allowed myself to keep speaking, even if no one responded. When my son left brochures about retirement homes on the table, I placed them back in his office without a word, no longer willing to hold them as though they were instructions for my future. These were small acts, barely noticeable perhaps, but inside they felt seismic, because each one reminded me that I still had choices, however minor, and choices are the seeds of freedom. The shoes waited. They glimmered by the bed like a question I had not yet answered, a dare I had not yet accepted, but I knew that one day, soon, I would wear them not in secret but in full sight, that I would step out of the room and let the sound of those heels strike the floor loud enough to remind everyone, including myself, that I was still walking, still present, still alive. The day the gold heels were discovered was the day the slow cruelty that had been building in the house finally uncoiled into open hostility, the kind that no longer pretends to be polite or casual, but bares its teeth under the thin veil of domestic concern. I had been careful, or so I thought, tucking the shoes beneath the bed during the day, only wearing them at night when the rest of the house was heavy with sleep. But carelessness grows when you begin to feel a little stronger, and one evening, after practicing my steps longer than usual, I forgot to put them back fully out of sight. The next morning, my granddaughter came into the room uninvited, searching for her hairbrush, which she claimed I had borrowed, and she saw them gleaming under the bed frame like contraband. "Oh my God," she squealed, dragging them out by the heels. "Look what Grandma's hiding." She shouted for her mother, and within moments the shoes were paraded into the kitchen, dangling from her hands like evidence in a trial I had not agreed to attend. My daughter-in-law took one look and burst out laughing, a harsh laugh that echoed against the cabinets. "Gold heels? Really? What exactly do you plan to do in these waltz around the nursing home ballroom?" My son entered then, his face tightening as he saw the shoes, not with amusement, but with irritation, as though I had crossed some line he had drawn long ago. "Mother," he said, voice clipped, "what is this supposed to be?" I wanted to answer with dignity, with some explanation that could make them understand, but the words caught in my throat, because what explanation could I give? That I needed something beautiful, something impractical, something that reminded me I was still a woman and not just a utility, that the sound of the heels striking the floor made me feel alive in ways their silence never did. I remained silent too long, and silence in that house was always interpreted as guilt. My daughter-in-law shook her head, her lips curling into a smile that was sharper than any sneer. "You'll break your neck in these." Maybe that's the plan. Less trouble for everyone. She set them on the counter as though they were contaminated, then turned back to the children who were now giggling, whispering about me, playing dress-up. My son picked them up, weighed them in his hands, then placed them back down more firmly than necessary. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said. "You're not thinking clearly anymore. You're making irresponsible choices. It's why we need to start putting things in order." I knew what he meant by in order. The brochures he had been leaving on the table, the subtle conversations about assisted living, the repeated hints about downsizing, about safety, about financial responsibility, all of it was funneling toward one point. He wanted control, not only of where I lived, but of everything I owned, everything I had left, that still made me more than a dependent shadow in his house. That afternoon, he sat me down at the dining table with a neat stack of papers, sliding them across to me with the same voice he used with clients, calm and patronizing, the voice of someone who has already decided what is best for you. "It's just a power of attorney," he said. "This way we can take care of things properly. Bills, medical decisions, anything that comes up. It'll save everyone stress, everyone, meaning him, his wife, his household." I picked up the pen he placed before me, not to sign, but to feel its weight, to give myself a moment of breathing room. And I looked at his face, the same face I once bent over as a child, wiping soup from his chin, soothing him after nightmares, kissing his forehead when fever spiked. That face was now a mask of control, of certainty that he knew better, that the woman who had raised him had become an inconvenience to be managed. "I'll think about it," I said. He frowned. "There's nothing to think about. It's practical. We'll all sleep easier knowing everything is handled." I set the pen down. I said I'll think about it. His eyes hardened then, the polite mask slipping just enough to reveal the impatience beneath. My daughter-in-law appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, clearly eavesdropping, and I realized the two of them had rehearsed this moment, had decided together that today would be the day I surrendered the last scraps of authority over my own life. From that day on, the pressure thickened. My belongings continued to vanish. This time, not just cups and photographs, but clothing, scarves, a book of recipes in my handwriting that I found later crumpled in the recycling bin. When I asked where things had gone, the answers were vague, evasive, and always delivered with a smile that told me questions were unwelcome. The children picked up the tone, too. They began repeating small phrases they had heard. One afternoon, my grandson muttered, "Grandma's losing it," under his breath, not to me, but near me, as though testing how far he could push. My granddaughter filmed me while I was dozing in the chair, then showed me the video of my slack mouth, my tilted head, laughing. "You look like you're already dead." I did not scold them. I could not. I simply stood, walked to the kitchen, and washed my hands until the sting of soap distracted me from the sting in my chest. The final humiliation came one Sunday evening when they had guests over, neighbors from down the street, people with perfect lawns and glossy smiles. I was told beforehand not to join them at the table, that it would be too much for me, that I should eat earlier in the kitchen and leave the entertaining to them. So I sat in my small room, listening to the hum of voices, the clink of glasses, the rise and fall of laughter that excluded me. Later, When the guests had gone, I came into the kitchen to clear the plates, and on the counter sat my gold heels, deliberately placed there like a centerpiece of mockery. My daughter-in-law leaned against the sink and said, "If you want to play dress-up, you should at least do it somewhere private." People talk. My son looked at me, eyes cold, and said, "We can't go on like this, Mother. You're making things difficult for everyone." Sign the papers I did not answer. I gathered the plates, stacked them neatly, carried them to the sink, and washed them in silence while they stood behind me. The water was hot, scalding, but I did not flinch. I let the steam rise around me, let it blur the edges of their voices, and in that cloud I felt something shift. They thought they were cornering me, pushing me toward surrender, but in truth they were pushing me toward clarity. The more they tried to erase me, the more visible I became to myself. I realized with a kind of cold certainty that their escalation, their demand for control, was not the end of my story, but the beginning of my refusal. That night, when the house was quiet again, I slipped into the gold heels and stood before the mirror. My reflection looked back at me, not softened, not erased, but defiant. I traced the line of my jaw, the curve of my shoulders, the glint of determination in my tired eyes, and I whispered to myself, "You're not gone. Not yet. And not like this." The next day, I tucked the heels into a bag, not to hide them, but to prepare, because I knew then that the time for secrecy was over. They wanted me to crawl, to surrender, to hand over the keys to everything I had built, but I was already planning my step beyond their reach. They thought the escalation would break me. They did not realize it had only lit the path out. The night I left, there was no thunderclap of drama, no raised voices, no storm of confrontation that would have given them the satisfaction of believing they had finally broken me. Instead, there was only the steady rhythm of my own decision, the clarity of a choice that had been forming like a tide beneath the surface, invisible until it reached the point where it could no longer be held back. I waited until the house was submerged in sleep, the televisions dark, the doors closed, the murmurs of their lives sealed behind walls that no longer included me. I had packed quietly in the days before, one shirt folded at a time, one book tucked away, one scarf rolled and hidden, until a small suitcase stood ready in the corner of my room, unremarkable to anyone who might have glanced inside, but heavy with the weight of everything I had refused to surrender. The gold heels lay on top, gleaming faintly under the weak lamp, and I slipped them onto my feet with a steadiness that surprised me. They pinched, yes, and my knees warned me that every step would be a negotiation. But in that moment, the discomfort became a kind of fuel, a reminder that dignity was never meant to be painless. I lifted the suitcase, careful not to scrape it against the floorboards, and opened the door to the hallway. For a moment I paused, listening to the house breathe, the creak of its timbers, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and I thought of all the nights I had lain awake within its walls, shrinking myself so as not to disturb, waiting for the sighs of disapproval to pass, rehearsing the art of silence until it had almost erased me. No more. I stepped forward, the click of the heels against the wood startling in the stillness, loud in a way that made my heart pound. But instead of retreating, I welcomed the sound. Each step was a declaration, each click a refusal to vanish. I walked the length of the hall, through the living room where the shadows of their furniture loomed, past the kitchen where the scent of last night's wine still lingered, and out the door that had once been locked to me in everything but name. The air outside was cool, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and distant blossoms, and for the first time in years I felt it wrap around me without judgment. I pulled the door closed behind me, careful not to let it slam, not because I wanted to leave gently, but because I knew this was not an exit for their ears to witness. This was mine alone, a leaving that did not require their acknowledgement. The street was empty, save for a single cat slinking across the pavement, and I stood for a moment under the thin glow of the street lamp, adjusting the strap of the suitcase, steadying myself on the narrow heels, and breathing deeply the air of a world that no longer had walls pressing in on me. I walked slowly, not from hesitation, but from necessity, each step deliberate, each sound of the heels striking the pavement echoing into the night, like a metronome guiding me forward. The suitcase bumped lightly against my leg, and I thought of how often I had carried bags heavier than this for others, groceries for my son, laundry for the children, errands that were always expected but never acknowledged, and how different it felt. Now to carry weight solely for myself. I reached the bus stop at the end of the street, a simple bench under a crooked sign, and sat down, lowering the suitcase beside me. My feet ached, my knees trembled, but I looked down at the gold shimmer against the dull concrete and felt a pulse of pride because I knew that every blister would be worth the price of reclaiming my own steps. As I waited, a young woman approached, no older than my granddaughter, her arms full of books, her hair loose in the breeze. She glanced at me briefly, then her eyes fell to my shoes, and she smiled without hesitation. "Those are beautiful," she said. Just 3 words, spoken casually, but they pierced deeper than all the dismissals I had endured, because here, from a stranger with no history of me, came recognition, not of my age or my utility, but of my presence. Beautiful. I thanked her softly, and she nodded, already turning back to her phone, unaware that she had just confirmed something I had needed desperately to believe, that I was still visible. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard with care, the driver barely glancing at me, and took a seat near the window. The city passed in fragments outside, streetlights flickering, houses shuttered, the occasional shadow of a late-night walker, and with each passing block, the weight in my chest loosened. I did not know exactly where I would end up. I had a plan, yes, to go first to the bank and secure what remained of my savings, to rent a room somewhere small but mine. But beyond that, the details were still mist. Yet for the first time in years, the mist felt like possibility rather than threat. I pressed my hand against the suitcase, feeling the hum of the bus beneath my palm, and I whispered to myself, "You are leaving. You are leaving. You are leaving." By the time the bus reached downtown, the first light of morning was breaking, pale and tentative, painting the glass towers and old brick buildings in equal softness. I stepped off, the suitcase bumping against the curb, and walked toward the bank where I had once opened an account in my husband's name decades earlier. The clerk looked at me politely, without recognition of the life behind my face, and asked how she could help. I told her firmly that I needed to secure my funds in an account under my sole authority. No other names attached, no shared access. My voice did not tremble. She typed, nodded, stamped, handed me papers to sign, and with each movement I felt the invisible ties that had bound me to my son's household, snapping one by one. When it was done, I stepped back onto the street, the papers folded in my bag, the heels catching light in the growing sun, and I felt taller than I had in years, not because of the extra inches the shoes gave me, but because of the decision that could not be undone. I had walked out. I had acted. I had refused the crawl they had tried to reduce me to, and though I did not know what lay ahead, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never return to that house, never again shrink myself into silence within its walls. This was the climax, though no one but me knew it. For them, I was gone quietly, without farewell, leaving only an absence they would interpret however they wished. But for me, it was an eruption, a breaking of chains, a crossing into a life that, however modest, would be mine. The fire had burned my shoes, yes, but it had not burned me. I walked now in gold, and the sound of those heels was the sound of my freedom. Now, in this small room above the pharmacy, where the ceiling hums with the faint vibration of the refrigerators below, and the walls carry the muted conversations of strangers passing in the stairwell, I find a stillness that is mine alone, and each morning when I wake, I see the gold heels standing by the window, catching whatever light the day has to offer, and I polish them with a soft cloth as if they were relics, not of vanity, but of defiance, reminders that I did not surrender, that I stepped away rather than let myself be erased. The room is simple, with a bed just wide enough for me, a table that bears the marks of other tenants before me, and a window that frames the street where people come and go without knowing who I am. Yet it is enough because for the first time in decades, every object here belongs to me, and no one sneers when I reach for them. The kettle whistles, and I let it sing as long as I wish. No sighs rising from another room, no rolling eyes, no muttered complaints about the noise of an old woman's breathing. I take my tea by the window, sip slowly, and watch the ordinary life of the street unfold below. And in those moments, I feel a peace that has nothing to do with safety provided by others and everything to do with the fragile strength of having claimed my own space. Sometimes I imagine what they say about me now, back in the house I left, whether they tell neighbors that I moved into a facility, whether they present my absence as a decision they kindly arranged, whether they shake their heads and say I was becoming difficult, unstable, ungrateful. They can shape whatever story they wish, for their words no longer bind me. I did not leave a forwarding address. I did not leave a trail to be followed. Only a note on the kitchen table in my careful handwriting. I am not a thing to be managed. I am not a shadow to be hidden. Do not look for me. I have left, but I am not lost. Perhaps they crumpled it. Perhaps they read it aloud in mockery. Perhaps they ignored it altogether, but none of that matters. The act of writing it, of leaving it behind like a final breath expelled, was enough. Here, I am not erased. The grocer downstairs greets me with a nod. The pharmacist asks about my knees with genuine interest. The landlord repairs the leaky faucet without suggesting that I am a burden. They do not know my history. They do not measure me against the years I spent bending myself into silence. And perhaps that is the greatest gift. Anonymity that allows me to start again. I have even begun to write, slowly, on scraps of paper gathered in a drawer, fragments of memory and thought that one day may form a story, not for my son, not for my grandchildren, not for anyone who tried to laugh me into invisibility, but for myself and perhaps for some other woman who, years from now, might find herself shrinking in a house that no longer wants her and might need proof that escape is possible. At night, when the city quiets and the streetlights cast long shadows across the floor, I sometimes slip my feet into the gold heels and walk the length of the room. The boards here creak too, but they creak only for me, and I let the sound fill the air without apology. I do not walk far. I do not need to. The act itself is enough, the act of claiming each step as mine, not borrowed, not tolerated, not hidden. I imagine the laughter that once tried to cage me, the fire that once sought to diminish me, and I hear instead the echo of heels on wood, steady, deliberate, undeniable. I do not pretend that leaving erased the wounds. They live in me still, the sting of dismissal, the ache of betrayal by the very child I once carried, the shadows of words spoken as if they were harmless, when in truth they hollowed me out. But pain is not the same as defeat. Pain is proof that I have lived, that I have felt deeply, that I have survived. And survival, I now understand, is not merely breathing in a room where you are unwanted. Survival is choosing to step out of that room and breathe where the air is your own. So if any woman ever hears my voice, let her hear this. Do not wait for permission to claim your dignity. Do not let the burning of your shoes or the erasure of your belongings or the silencing of your voice convince you that you must crawl. Even if you have to walk into the unknown, even if your knees ache and your feet blister, step forward anyway. Let your heels, however impractical, however absurd, strike the ground and announce that you are still here. I was told to crawl, but I walked out in gold.